Good evening, and welcome to Wilson Hall Auditorium. Please take a moment to locate your nearest emergency exit, and at this time, please stop texting and turn off your cell phone. There will be no intermission. Thank you, and enjoy the presentation.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Great to be here together for our 2024 celebration of Constitution Day. Of course, very fitting here at the institution named for the main architect and author of the Constitution. Tonight's a joint effort of the Office of the President and the Madison Center for Civic Engagement, and it's great to be together this evening. My name is David Kirkpatrick. I serve as Vice President and Chief of Staff in the Office of the President, as well as an Associate Professor in our Department of Philosophy and Religion. This evening, we have the privilege of hearing from Raj Vinnakota, who is one of the leading voices nationwide in this topic of civil discourse and how do we bridge our divides, our political divides that all of us are so familiar with in our country. And so we'll begin this evening with hearing from Raj, a brief talk, and then we'll have a fireside chat. Myself and Dr. Dillard will lead us. We'll also be joined on stage by one of our undergraduate democracy fellows. And then we will open it up to our audience, to you all. So as you're listening to the conversation, be thinking about a question that you want to ask Raj as well. Before I introduce Raj, I also want to take a moment to acknowledge our president is here, President Charlie King, and our First Lady, Sherry King. I want to just mention that I'm grateful for the voice of our president, who is often talking about our pluralistic campus and how we can come together across our divides and accomplish shared goals. And so I'm grateful for that example and inspiration from President King as we do this work on campus. I also want to acknowledge the hard work of the team who made tonight possible. Sarah Saccone and University Events, who's been a wonderful partner for us throughout this year and for many years in doing this work. Kara Dillard, Logan Ziegler, Monica, Jonathan, Aiden, and all the fellows at the Madison Center who are doing this great work, as well as Callie Vogel in the President's Office. Thank you for making tonight possible. So I mentioned this evening, it's fitting here at James Madison University, the principal author of the Constitution, to gather together in celebration, but also to look ahead at our shared work in our constitutional republic. It's also fitting to remember as we sit here in Virginia, of course, the Constitution was not Madison's first set of brilliant writings. One thinks of the Virginia Plan, where Madison gave us the three branches of government, or that inspiration for it, as well as our bicameral government. One particular quote from Madison I think is timely for us this evening. He wrote in the lead up to when he was writing the Constitution, he wrote, quote, "A crisis has arrived, which will decide whether the American experiment will be a blessing to the world or will blast forever the hopes which the Republican cause had inspired." Similar to us today, Madison felt, he shared this later in the Federalist Papers, that the greatest threat to the American experience being a blessing to the world was the idea of factions, something we're not familiar with at all in this country, divisions, right, that threaten unity or threaten our ability to come together to shared solutions. And in one of my favorite pieces, James Madison writes in Federalist number 10 about his concern for the common good as an essential goal of government. He believed that through the mechanisms of the new Constitution, that our government should and could prevent the tyranny of factions and ultimately promote the common good. So we gather again this evening with similar hopes that the American experiment would again be a blessing to the world, and it is, and we might carry on that torch that Madison passes to us here at JMU, at the university named after him. We share the sacred responsibility to dialogue together and to bridge our divides in pursuit of the common good in our great nation. Perhaps no one in this country is leading this effort better and more widely than our speaker here this evening. Raj Vinnakota is the 7th president of the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, formerly the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation in Princeton. Prior to joining CNS in July 2019, Raj served as the EVP of the Youth and Engagement Division at the Aspen Institute. For 18 years, Raj was the co-founder and CEO of the SEED Foundation, the nation's first network of public college preparatory boarding schools for underserved children. Raj's work has earned him recognition in the form of fellowships from the Echoing Green, the Ashkota Foundation, and the Aspen Institute, as well as winning recognitions such as the Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson Award, Harvard University's Innovation in American Government Award, and Oprah Winfrey's Use Your Life Award. In addition to being a former trustee and executive committee member for Princeton University, Raj is the former national chair of Princeton's annual giving committee. Raj majored in molecular biology, which I'm sure he'll mention later on, and also earned a certificate of studies from the Woodrow Wilson School of International Affairs and Public Policy at Princeton. He'll be speaking to us this evening with the title, The Most Important Skill You'll Learn in College. Please join me in welcoming Raj Vinnakota.
Thank you, David, for that kind introduction, and also to Kara for everything that you've done today and such a warm introduction, greetings, time here. And President King, thank you so much for having me. It is an honor and a joy to be here to celebrate Constitution Day. I am going to dive directly into my talk because I know that we'll have a lot of time to engage a little bit more about my background. And yes, molecular biology will come up, but not while I'm up here. Because I've been asked to speak today about something so important that it did become the title. But let me warn you, it's actually a pretty difficult skill to master, even at the same time while it's a skill that seems simple to understand. And just as to kind of get this out of the way, it's not a skill that's the ability to throw a football well enough that you can pass for 388 yards against UNC or score 53 points in the first half. Nor is it a skill of shooting a basketball so well that you can beat my Wisconsin Badgers during March. No, see, this is a skill that you can use every day, though I've used basketball most days myself, and which will have an impact on how you engage at work, at home, with friends, and with others, and with all American citizens. So what is it? Let's start with a quick show of hands. Who's heard of civil discourse before? Raise your hand. Keep it high. Now, keep your hand up if you really know what it means. Oh, that's pretty good. JMU, you're doing a good job. Yeah. Okay, you can put your hands down now. And before I share with you what my definition of civil discourse, I'd like to share examples of what happens when civil discourse actually works. You see, we see the outcomes of productive civil discourse all around us, just if we're paying attention. Because countless local town hall meetings, school board referendums, and state budgets are the product of significant engagement by people of very different, engaging in debate, compromise, which eventually lead to community decision. It's everywhere. And when I say everywhere, I don't mean just within the bubble of friends or home communities or the people that are just around you. It can also happen and needs to happen across political and ideological lines because there's often overlap to be found. Here's an example. Ever heard of the bipartisan infrastructure law? Yeah? Sounds boring, right? But it's actually super important. Think about what your daily routine will look like this semester. Heading to classes, working at a part-time job, or catching up on an assignment at a downtown cafe. Now, imagine dealing with outdated public transit, roads full of potholes, crumbling sidewalks, or unreliable internet that crashes while you're writing your paper. No, that never happened. But the 2021 bipartisan infrastructure bill aimed to fix these issues. So what does this have to do with civil discourse? Lawmakers from different parties had to work together to pass this bill, negotiate its size, to focus on where the funds needed to go, and to identify how those funds needed to be raised. Through civil discourse, they made it happen, benefiting everyday Americans like them. And they did it during a divisive moment of political party battles when very little happened in either the side. Here's a second example, but one that's not as political: the development of the COVID vaccine. You see, science research, science research also requires open inquiry, curiosity, intellectual humility, and the free flow of information. Not all scientists have the same point of view. They may not see eye to eye. So this type of community is critical. Without it, we would never have come up with the mRNA vaccination approach decades ago, nor would we have moved as quickly to develop the correct antibodies when COVID showed up. Scientists debated which ideas might work, developed multiple hypotheses, shared what they learned from testing, and continued debating and testing and learning until we had a discourse of this type literally saved millions of lives. So these are two examples of what happens when civil discourse, the why. But now let me go back to the question, what is civil discourse? Let me break it down for you from my definition. Civil discourse is about having respectful conversations about issues of public concern, even when we disagree. Civil discourse is about having respectful conversations about issues of public concern, even disagree. And I would add, probably particularly when we disagree. And what I'm talking about are hard-hitting conversations about the big, thorny topics that can be tough to talk about. The Israeli-Hamas war, climate change, gender identity, education policy, crime and policing, reproductive health. They can also be local issues that require public decision-making, school budgets, local taxes, housing development, allocation of practice time to the local ball fields. And I believe that there are two goals around civil discourse. The first goal is to understand each other, what I say about keeping. And the second goal of discourse is to prepare you to thrive in a complex and divided, and to arm you with the skills to solve problems that face your hometowns and across the country. See, a healthy civil society relies on a foundation of understanding, trust, and a commitment to remaining in community, learning, working, living together. For a representative democracy like ours to function effectively, citizens must engage in constructive dialogue on different to find the solution. So, once again, as a little survey, raise your hand if you found yourself in a tough conversation with friends or family members about any of these issues. Yes? Keep your hands raised if you wish you had the skills to have these conversations more productive. Yeah. Okay. So learning and practicing civil discourse will be a game changer for these tough conversations. And it'll also be a game changer right here at JMU for your college experience. It'll help you understand different perspectives and build stronger relationships. It may even lead you to changing your mind on some issue. And plus, as I've mentioned, it's essential for a healthy. So let me share a few stories of the value of civil discourse for a nation, for a policy, for interactions with people with whom you don't agree. And I'll start with Nelson Mandela. Have you heard of Nelson Mandela? Yes? So Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison under apartheid, a brutal system, political, economic, and geographic segregation by race in South Africa. During his time in prison, Mandela became an international icon. He galvanized a global movement to topple the justice system. When he got out, however, he didn't seek revenge. Instead, he pushed for reconciliation and unity. Even though it would have been easy for a nation of 33 million non-white people to have brought violence to 5 million white people. Mandela was elected president in 1994 as a result of the first multiracial national election. And in 1996, 2 years later, he started the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to help people have respectful conversations about past justice. Both victims of gross human rights violations and the perpetrators of violence gave testimony over the next 2 years, some of which were public hearings, and most of which was released in a national. Mandela himself personally engaged in civil discourse with those who had once been his adversary. And guess what? His approach of civil discourse helped heal a nation as it moved from a white-only government to a multiracial. In fact, his efforts were so impactful that in 1993, even before he was elected president, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize alongside then South Africa. But civil discourse is not just a skill for politicians. Let me tell you about Daryl Davis, a Black musician who took an unconventional approach to combating racism in America. At a very young age, Daryl was witness to some really vile hate and violence. And he remembers vividly wondering, how can you hate me when you don't even know me? And after college, he was a member of a band that played in a bar that attracted members of the Ku Klux Klan. He reached out to those members and engaged them in respectful conversation. Instead of confronting them with hostility, Davis approached them with curiosity and an open mind. Think about that. A Black man spending time with members of the KKK. Don't believe me, you can go Google the news pieces that actually show him at KKK rallies. He listened to them and he connected with them. Once people feel they're being listened to, he says, it's easier to plant a seed of. Over the years, guess how many KKK members he was able to convince to change their minds through these respectful conversations? How many people do you think got to turn in their robe? Any idea? Probably not 100,000. I don't know if there's 100,000 members of KKK, but he was able to get more than 200 to turn in their robes, including a grand dragon of the KKK. For 200. Adam Grant, who's an organizational psychologist up at the University of Pennsylvania, states that Daryl Davis demonstrates that talking face-to-face with your ideological opponent can motivate them to rethink their view. He's an extraordinary example of what psychologists have repeatedly shown with evidence. In over 500 studies, interacting face-to-face with an outcome, someone who's not part of your group, reduced prejudice 94%. Okay, so I know what you might be thinking. I'm not Nelson Mandela. I'm not Daryl Davis, nor am I a politician who can pass an infrastructure bill. Well, neither am I. So let me actually share an example of civil discourse that'll help you succeed in your career after you leave JMU. It is an example of my own life. Early in my career, as David told you in the introduction, a friend of mine and I decided to open a boarding school for students from under-resourced Washington. Eric and I called our schools the Seed School. This wasn't your typical boarding school. Students lived with us during the week, and then they went home on weekends to stay connected with their family. Eric and I shared many of the same core values, but we didn't always see eye to eyes on issues of public concern, including our views on how to change the education system here in the United States. You might be surprised to hear that. How could we be business partners and not agree on education? Here's why. Unlike what you might see on social media or in the news, most issues are not clearly binary. They're not simple pro and a con. In fact, most issues have a lot of gray area in them. And Eric and I acknowledged that. But we also needed to figure out a method to come to agreement when we disagreed. After all, we were equal partners in a nonprofit that we'd started together. So what did we come up with? Simple. We agreed that we would discuss and debate the issues until we first understood the different points of view, and then we try to land on the best position for the organization. Sometimes it took a few minutes. In other instances, it took a few hours. And a few times, it went overnight or as long as necessary. We had committed to stay in community. That is, to lead our organization and to understand and debate our approaches to get to the best place for our organization. And we did this so often and in full visibility of our colleagues that we ended up making it a core operating value for the organization. We called it arguing joyfully. In actuality, it was civil discourse. And arguing joyfully strengthened our relationship and strengthened our work. But it did more. It became a hiring and retention advantage for the organization. People liked to work at an organization where their views were acknowledged. They were understood. They were part of the decision making. We liked to hire people who would bring their diverse views to work. And they all committed to engaging in civil discourse and come to the best answers for our Seed schools grew, our school in DC, Baltimore, and Miami, and we attracted and retained some of the best colleagues in the business. But we weren't the only organization who understood the power of civil discourse. That concept has now taken root everywhere. In fact, 86% of employers say that learning to engage across different is essential preparation for the work, according to the most recent employer survey from the American Association of College and Universities. 86%. So this skill is essential for the workforce that you're going to go into. I've shared the why of civil discourse and the what. So for the last few minutes, I want to talk about the how. You'll find yourselves in many difficult conversations around issues and topics this year. Roommate, classmate, professor, your parents. How do you do civil discourse? Let me just start by saying there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. Civil discourse with your roommate will look different than it might in a classroom setting. The good news here at JMU is that the school is providing you many opportunities to practice. Over time, you'll get better at it, and your civil discourse muscle will grow strong. So I'll give you one simple way of thinking about it. Imagine you and your college roommate are discussing a hot topic like Israel. After your roommate shares her point of view, you should pause, clarify. Pause, clarify. Essentially, what you're doing is you're taking a minute to process what she said and then repeat back what you heard to show that you're listening and hearing. Next, ask curious questions. Ask curious questions. These aren't gotcha questions. Instead, they're curious questions so that you get more of an understanding of your. And then, and only do you share your. When it's your turn, tell her your point of view, perhaps through a personal experience you've had. And then repeat these steps until you both agree to conclude the conversation. Not to necessarily come to agreement, but to build a shared understanding of where each of you is coming from. And not necessarily to win or change people's mind at the moment. So that may happen. But to gain a better understanding. Now, you may say that sounds easy. And I'm here to tell you it's actually not. Because this approach requires being open-minded, what we in academics call intellectual. That's not so easy nowadays. We all have positions and work and words that spark visceral, emotional responses. That's normal. We also have personal positions that we hold sacrosanct and deeply important. Yet others, they have different. That's. Yet this discourse requires that we hold these reactions. We hold while we practice respect, curiosity, empathy. That's hard. That's why you. The second challenge here is that you need to create the social permission for you and your classmates to practice this approach. Now, JMU has actually created and taken this first critical step because the institution has given you the permission to engage in it. And that's great. But now you need to give your classmates the same, to engage in this, to be open-minded, to think about challenging thoughts, to not say dumb things. So even given these challenges, I hope that this sounds like something that you will give. And I hope and trust that you will. Well, in fact, I think you're going to have to because of what JMU is doing, right? But this skill will enhance your interactions with friends, roommates, classmates, families, and it'll be invaluable in professional life as you engage. And not only here, college is a really unique. You're lucky to be surrounded by incredibly different backgrounds. And after college, you may not be surrounded by so many people such. So I hope you make the most of this opportunity. Use this time to practice and build. Think of it as a chance to contribute to a more inclusive, understanding. This is the most important skill. So consider this as an early lesson. Like any skill, you'll hone it with practice, You'll do it in a diverse environment. Say civil discourse is about having respectful conversations about public, even when, as you vote upcoming election on November, as you enter the public square, you will be the ones who will need to model the way, the ones whom I will rely on to make our thank
Thank you for those comments, Raj. That was absolutely fantastic. I have so many things I want to ask you, but let me start. Let me start all the way back at the beginning. Tell us your life story, or more specifically, you were a molecular biologist, and tell us how you got from molecular biology to being one of the most foremost thinkers on democracy, civil discourse, and the need to be an effective.
I will. Can you hear me? Great. I will take you back even further just to bore you. So I was born, as you can probably tell, was born in Lausanne, Switzerland. My father won one of 2 scholarships to his PhD in civil engineering, École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne. He showed up in 1964 without a coat and not knowing French, and literally taught himself French while doing his doctorate. Ended up getting a job as a professor. Went back home to India to get an arranged marriage. Went back to Switzerland. I was born there. My sister was born there, and then they decided to move to the United States. So I'm an immigrant here. I think that's an important part of thinking about why I hold the values that I've discussed so dear. This country continues to be the nation that more people want than any other. Things that I've discussed, things that James Madison and others said, part of. That's why for me, this is not just a vocation, but advocacy, something that I believe deeply. Now to your question. How the heck did you get from molecular biology? By the time I went to college, it was in the late 80s, AIDS was truly the in our. I wanted to try to help find a solution. And so I went to study molecular biology, specifically like help in studying how we could try to tackle that issue. I worked very hard. In fact, I worked so hard I was burned out. So by the time I graduated, I said, I need to take some time off. And I did what anyone in the early 90s did when they didn't know what they wanted to do. I went into management consulting. And so I went to management consulting for a couple of years, loved it, learned so much, but also realized first was I didn't have it in me to go back 9 more years to get an MD. And the second is I didn't want to be in management consulting much longer. But I did want to still focus on solving, right? Went to college to thought about AIDS, went to management consulting because I want to think about business problems, I want to go do the next. And it ended up being that at a college reunion, a number of friends and I started about urban education. And one of my friends asked a very simple, he said, there's boarding schools for rich, there are boarding schools for rich. And I told myself, we can't be the first ones to be asked this question. And so I took a leave of absence from my job and I traveled around the country for 2 months and went and spent time at boarding school, talked to a host of people, learned so much, and met Eric Adler, the person that I talked about, my partner on this work. And we decided to both leave the job. Went and started the nation's first urban public boarding school in 1998, spent 18 years there, and then left to go work at the Aspen Institute and was really given a blank slate. Walter hired me and said, start a division working with young people. And that was the direction. And I decided to focus around the notion of civic, the Aristotelian concept about how it is that we take into account the needs and interests of the community in equal balance to our own personal interests. How do we do that? And how do we ensure that that happens for young people's time? And so we spent a number of years doing that work. In 2018, I left the Aspen Institute, frankly, to be more proximate to the work. As you'll remember, right? There were a lot of us, including myself, who thought the house was on fire. And I really wanted to get engaged much more closely with democracy work. And I ended up syndicating a national study to rethink civic education. And one of the key things that I did is I went out and got 3 funders to come together to help support our work. And the 3 funders were the Hewlett Foundation, Michael Bloomberg, and Charles and David Koch, which was the first time that those 3 funders had come together in a joint project. But it was really important as a signaling device to do that, because I wanted to demonstrate that there are certain things that are worthy of people coming together, even they don't agree ideologically on the law. And one of those is we need to do a better job of developing citizens in our country. That was the work that I started and then brought to the Institute of Citizens Scholars. And it's moved from a vocation to something more, a desire to really work and ensure that the 14 to 24 age group, the 68 million young people who are entering the public square in the next decade, are the kinds of citizens that our nation needs to have for a self-governing polity. Sorry for that long answer.
No, that's great. Thank you, Raj. And Kara, I'm already getting off track on my questions. This is not my prepared question, but I think your story, Raj, is a great example of sampling. And we had David Epstein on campus here, wrote a really good book called Range, and talks about how when we think of successful people like Michael Jordan or Roger Federer or Yo-Yo Ma, we think of somebody who, from the age of 1, all they did was, or Tiger Woods, all they did was golf, and they golf all the way through. And David Epstein argues most people who get successful in something like that, a Yo-Yo Ma, actually sample for a long period of time. It's a argument for liberal arts in a university like ours, where you take general education courses. But to the student here who might be thinking, I got to figure out exactly what I'm going to do, and I'm going to go on one course, I'm going to get this degree, and I'm going to do it for my whole life. What do you say to a student who might feel anxious about nearing graduation and they're not sure what they want to do? How does your story speak to that and the value of sampling?
The first thing I'll say is it's completely human that you're anxious about it, right? So society has engendered that anxiety even earlier than college, right? High school. My one child, my daughter, just graduated high school, and for the last 2 years, every adult in her life has asked her, "What are you going to do in life, and what are you going to major in, and where do you think you're going to go to college?" Right? So it is perfectly fine to feel it. Now, let me just tell you that there are actually very few jobs for which you have to have such intense technical experience that experimenting will literally take you off. Very few. And almost everything that you do in life, both vocation and internship, requires the skills of being a prepared and engaged. How do you think about civil discourse? How do you talk across? How do you work and mentor and build social capital in your community? How do you discern fact from opinion, from fiction, disinformation? How do you build trust in your communities so that you make sure that you and your neighbors can work together towards common cause? Those, believe it or not, are the skills that you're building in a liberal arts curriculum. You're being curious, taking different perspectives. You're challenging your own points of view. You're bringing empathy to different arguments. That's what all of these things do, right? So, David, I partly answered your question about college, but now if you think even further, let me just tell you, gosh, Oscar Wilde was right that youth was wasted on the young, because it is your time to experiment. Go try different things. For your parents are okay with it, but go try different things and test yourself, right? If I didn't go into consulting, I would have never actually built out some of the business capacity that allowed me to then build the business plan to start a boarding school. Now, I didn't think of it that way. In fact, I had no idea that that's where I would end up 3 years after college when I went into. But experimentation actually provides you, frankly, more arrows in your career.
So that path took you to higher ed. And KMU, if you don't know, is a founding member of the College Presidents for Preparedness. I know we met today with President King about that really important work that's being done. So now that's taking you to higher ed, can kind of dig down on that. Why do you see now that you've dedicated your life to this work, most of your work with colleges, college campuses, in this important time of polarization and having these important why is higher education, why are colleges so important as we talk about civil discourse, free speech? And then for those of us who want to see that kind of environment on campus, what are some of the things that students have? First, why higher ed? Why is this an
Sure. So higher ed is necessary but not sufficient. I mean, you need to be, if you want to think about how we specifically prepare young people, you need higher ed to play a role because, frankly, this is, as I said in my speech, a moment in time for young people when they're literally probably in the most diverse environment. Most of you will be in your life and being challenged, thinking about the issues, and building your own muscle of, okay, what are different ideas? What are my own points of view? How do I develop those? How do I develop the skills of being able to convince people and hear their arguments? Those are applicable throughout your life, but this, frankly, is, I mean this in the most positive way, a crucible where you can learn towards your own points of view. And so that's really, really important. And there are very few other. Now, having said that, let's also be honest, right? Fewer than 50% of people, I'm sorry, now it's 60% of people go into higher ed. So you also need to have other levers and other programs. So we're doing all this work in the workforce so that we can ensure that there's other ways. We also are working online so that we can think about other ways in which young people also. But to me, what was really valuable as we started to build these college presidents, we started in early 2021 having these conversations with presidents. And when we announced ourselves public August of last year, we were at 15 presidents, right? JMU was one of 15 presidents who said, we need to center civic preparation as a core responsibility. Today, 103 institutions, literally 13. People are recognizing this is something that's lacking and that higher education has a responsibility to this. And the more institutions that we bring, the greater the power to learn from each other, engage with. That for us, the major. I should also say that we've been very deliberate from as we build out, that this be a very broad set of institutions, that we needed all kinds of schools of higher education involved. In institutions like JMU, state flagship institutions, historically black colleges, small liberal arts colleges, AAU institutions, because all of them share in this. Now community colleges, 2-year. So we are recognizing as
So in 2026, America celebrates its semi-quincentennial. Try saying that fast times and without practice. And you are leading some of this work in helping our nation both collect records with the past, but also thinking together about what our nation can do for the next. And so my question to you about this work, you're co-leading it, so maybe that takes the pressure off a little bit as well, but in co-leading the civic education. But my question to you is, why would it be so important as we think about both the past and the present, to think about the past as we consider what it means to be a more.
So I think you've just said the word, right? Which is a more perfect union. We are on a journey. I can't tell you where we are on that. It has gone up and down and taken swings, and generally I would say it's going up. But we have a long way to go, and we need to recognize where we've been, the mistakes we've made so we don't make them again, and how it is that we improve our society. And here's why being engaged, I deal with this. I recently had a conversation to who said, like, not really that important. They're all. And part of the conversation, I engaged in thoughtful discussion. I listened to them. I said, tell me your point of view. And their perspective was,
when they looked at higher education, when they looked at what was happening in Washington, D.C., when they looked at where we were as a society, they're like, look, like government hasn't helped us, and government is not helping us and get to where we want to go. So why should I engage? And my response was, great point. You're absolutely right in terms of the data. But that then asks the question, does that mean that there's a greater likelihood that government will work if you don't engage or if you do? And we then discussed, even if you're unhappy with what's happening in Washington, remember the tremendous power of your voice in local community, in regional community, and in the state, where your voice can be incredibly powerful, right? I mean, one of the joys I had today is I talked to so many young people who are engaging not only here in Harrisonburg, but also across the state in different ways, and they are making a difference. They are showing what it means to be engaged citizens. The other thing I talked about is that we, unfortunately, as a society, over-index on voting as the way to talk about being a citizen. And it is really important. But like many other things, not. You need to engage in your communities in different ways. Mentoring, volunteering, running for office, modeling what it means to work across, thinking about how you trust your neighbor, even if he or she didn't necessarily vote like you. And then also thinking about how you come to points of view, bringing to you, yourself, very diverse perspectives that you can really, I like to say, complicate. Because very few things are binary in life. So you should be thinking about all of those things as you bring your voice, not only to November 5th this year, but how you engage going forward as we try to create a more perfect union on a, hopefully on a continually upward track.
Raj, you've been working with a number of college campuses like on embedding across the
There's
campus.
no college campus like JM.
I was going to say,
Okay.
no comparisons. That is very, very true. I didn't want to say it myself, but I'm glad you did. So working with college campuses like JMU, not as good as JMU.
Let me be clear. That wasn't meant just to get the audience. You not only were found one of 12 institutions that engage, but you are an example of some of the things I talked about in terms of civil discourse. And the other way in which you are really taking the lead, proud of, is trying to assess whether or not your work is actually happening. Very few institutions, frankly, have the courage to do that. You should be very proud that you're doing it. So, yes, I did it partly to get clapping from the audience, but be proud about being here because you are a leader. And I point.
Oh, feel free to interrupt those. And shout out to the Center for Assessment and Research Studies, obviously the Madison doing that assessment work. But so trying to get, let's just talk awesome all day. You got to break the top 25 in football too, after the weekend. But so embedding this all across college campuses, the work of having this health. Part of it is encouraging students to speak up with things that they know their classmates might disagree with, or things that, again, they might be uncomfortable with, or someone else might be uncomfortable with. We talk about the term pluralism. What do you see as, people are very different. We have differing point of views and backgrounds and experiences. What is healthy pluralism on a college?
So, to me, pluralism is about acknowledging the fact that there are people who come with very different lived experience, perspectives, and that intention is to honor the fact that that diversity actually makes the whole more than the sum of the parts. Ibu Patel at Interfaith America is really the leading thinker about this. And he talks about pluralism in some ways being like a buffet where everyone is asked to come to a potluck dinner. And everyone brings their thing. And everyone serves it, and everyone partakes of the whole potluck dinner. You don't have to take part in everything. But that whole is more than some each individual. Analogy about that. We're all bringing different things to the table. And it's really important to voice those perspectives and to make that part. I say this part because one of the ways that we think about civil discourse and whether or not it's effective on a campus, any one of you who engage with me today will know this, one of the things I've asked every single student, how comfortable are you speaking up when you think that you have a minority, right? One that's not the majority. And, the good news is the majority of you actually raised. I will tell you, that's not what I see. And that's really good because you need to get to the point where you're comfortable stating your perspective, talking with each other, even when you have minority perspective, because that adds to the value of the paper. That's what pluralism is, having that critical.
I was just gonna say I like that metaphor because I think what can happen with pluralism is you don't actually have a dish to bring, or we can say, this does not mean that you don't have deep convictions, or this doesn't mean that you only come to a potluck and take somebody else's convictions. You be yourself. You bring your whole self. That's not something that you necessarily need to compromise when you come into a pluralist context. I think that can happen with our students of faith, where someone saying, you need to leave that behind, and then everybody else brings their whole selves. And so recognizing you actually can bring a plate, and you can like that plate, right? And you can have that unique dish that makes that potluck healthy. But I think recognizing that as well, it doesn't mean that everything's just being blended together and there's no
I'm reflecting in this conversation about pluralism, how you had talked about the need for respectful conversation. Is there ever a conversation?
So this is speaking a little about, so I'm a Unitarian. I believe in the inherent. And I believe true, honest search for truth, right? And for that to happen, to believe in the inherent dignity, my answer is no, there isn't. For not, other people may have different points of view. I don't agree with, but I do have to edit for respect your humanity. And I'm not saying that's easy, right? In fact, it can be exceedingly hard, because our humanity also leads us to have those emotions which make up all of us. But we need to recognize that being able to engage with each other is at the core of how a society starts to break down when we decide we're going to draw lines. You are not. Now, I am not in any. I certainly, personally, am not in any. Decide who is in.
Well, wow. Okay, so let me let me ask maybe a more positive question, but I'll start off negatively, then hopefully get to the positive. So the Institute for Citizens and Scholars published a report on the youth civic outlook. And one of the key findings that came from this report was that 40% of students, only 40% of were able to correctly answer 1 out of 4 civic questions. And maybe that kind of pairs today when we were in our class lecture and I asked, so when is election day? And some student kind of popped up surprisingly, said, today? Like it was a pop quiz, and maybe that was today, and that was why strange people were in the classroom with them.
It's that guy with a tie in the front
exactly.
of the classroom.
Maybe he's running for president. I don't know. And so, clearly there is a deficit happening here. Not here at JMU, of course, but there is except for that one student. But there is. We'll get to that person. But tell me about this report, because I think it says both that there are dire situations happening in the education of our youth about the functions of government, the role of government, the values that they should have about democracy. What really stood out to you about this report? What does it mean for civic education for school, college?
The first answer is we have a ways to go. One of the other parts that came out of that is that those who actually came out better in that civic education report and actually had a better understanding of how government were also the ones who were more likely to engage more in civil discourse, to eschew violence as one of the ways in which they and so to me, right, we couldn't necessarily determine whether or not that was correlative or not, But to me, it said we need to understand how our government, we need to understand our history. We need to know who breaks the tie in the Senate, and those kinds of things. But to me, that is only one part of it. And you can learn that, but you also can learn how to engage in discourse, and you also need to learn how to build trust in your neighbor, in your. All of those things need to be happening in order to be kinds of citizens that. And at least to me, I would not try to suggest a linearity. One leads the other. All of those need. The other thing that research also showed to us, and we were survey was of 18, was that for the population that we surveyed, it was a national population, is that for them, being a citizen and thinking about engaging as a citizen was as much about understanding how government functions, rule of law, and so on, but even more about certain enduring values of fairness, justice, liberty, and so on. And so part of the lessons that I took away from that is we need to make sure when we talk to young people that the way in which they can interact with government, with voting, and so on, is to be able to see that actually if they engage as citizens, that those things are more likely.
Well, I love my last question, but I'm feeling like we need to bring Ivy up on the stage, our democracy fellow, and open it up to the audience as well. So Ivy, come on up. I want to introduce Ivy. Ivy is one of our undergraduate democracy fellows. She's a senior majoring in political science with dual minors and honors interdisciplinary studies and legal studies. On the pre-law track, she's been a democracy fellow for 2 years and currently serving as a Campus Vote Project fellow. Beyond JMU, Ivy has gained valuable experience working with the U.S. State Department, where she contributed to policy development for the Foreign Affairs Handbook. Ivy is deeply passionate about fostering civic engagement among new students at JMU while leading many of our initiatives that foster civil discourse and democratic engagement. Ivy, welcome to the stage.
Thank you so much, and thank you guys so much for having me. So my questions are curated specifically for students and aspiring civic leaders. As you guys know, Raj started with microbiology, and we never know what our career paths look like, but we do know there are millions of dollars going into AI and everything, but there's so many opportunities and such in this field. So I really wanted to cultivate some questions that might inspire some. So first, Raj, you mentioned earlier about your SEED Foundation, and you emphasized the importance of mentorship at work. So my question for you is, why is continued mentorship crucial for long-term development and success? And what qualities should a student look for who is civically engaged for?
So I want to give a little context on the mentorship because I know that we discussed it a little bit, but just so everyone understands. So I was 25 years old, Eric, 30. They literally called it two stunt kids. It's actually in a book. The reason that we were able to successfully literally get an amendment passed in Congress to fund school and be able to start up is because of the network that we were able to have. And for me, the single most important network was my alma mater. I called a number of people who lived around the district area, and they returned my call. And they talked, were helpful, made introductions, were able to get me into senators' office, representatives' offices to talk about this. They had no reason to do it except we were connected because we went to the same school. And our first two board members for SEED were some of those people who helped me out with introductions. They took interest and supported me in ways that I can never pay back. And so what I do is I pay it forward. I might get in trouble with this, but one of the things I do is when young people call me and ask me for advice on the things that they're starting, I always set aside the time for them. Why? Because when I was 25 and called these heads of law firms and people who were running big organizations, they made the time for me. And so part of what I know is really important is, frankly, the wisdom that comes with time and experience. What I brought to the game was I was naive, which allowed me to do things and ask things that no one else asked, and I was stubborn. I would never take no for an answer. But I also needed the experience and wisdom and connections and networks that other people brought to this, and that's what they brought to me. I'm pretty sure the JMU network is just as strong and only getting stronger over time. And so part of what I tell you is use it, leverage it, reach out in respectful sort of ways and ask for help. Have ideas and say, I'm thinking of doing this and you happen to be in this space. Can you give me 15 minutes, 20 minutes? Can you respond via email and so on? And then it's really important, remember to always pay it forward. And when people reach out to you, make the time for them. Because there is no way that you're ever going to thank those people enough, but you can thank the next generation.
And then just to tag on a little bit more, so in mentorship, the qualities, specifically relating to civic engagement, I know a lot of people go for mentors that are in the same partisan region as them, or maybe they're really committed to nonpartisanship, or are there any other characteristics of mentors that you're like, hey, this will really grow you as a person, and this is someone that you could see benefit from the more you discuss with them?
So I want to challenge conception around mentorship, just for a moment, just to be provocative, which is, if you look at the people that I now consider my most important, valuable mentors, not a single one of them did I think would become my mentor when I started to have conversation with them. And so part of what I want to frame around this is, don't look at this transactionally. Right? Don't look at the conversation as, I want you to be my mentor. Go into conversation saying, I want to learn something from you, and see whether or not things click. And over time, some of them will, some of them won't. And when you see that they click, that you have a personal relationship, work on deepening it in different ways and forms. Most of the people who are my mentors are actually not content experts in the work that I do. What they are is people who worry and think about my own professional development as a human being, as a husband, as a father, as a neighborhood leader. And they think about those things and how important those pieces are to who I am and what I do. Right? So that's an overall frame that I just would ask you to think about as you go. And there are people who will say, I'd love for you to be my mentor. And my response is, let's have another conversation in 45 days. Right? And just see where it goes and so on and so forth. And I don't make any commitments, and we'll see where they go. So now to your actual question. I apologize for taking me so long to get to it. But in the end, mentorship has to be a mutually beneficial relationship, right? And mentorship has to be a relationship that's not based on transaction, but is based upon, frankly, more affective domain, developmental, joy-related aspects to life. The mentorships that I'm engaged in, either a mentor or being a mentee, bring joy for me, right? I look forward to those conversations. I enjoy those conversations. And every once in a while, those conversations are really painful. Why? Because my mentor can tell me things that no one else will tell me. Right? That person can say, Raj, let me be honest with you, you kind of screwed up here. Right? But they're still based upon a joy and a relationship that's built over time.
Yeah, that was beautifully said. And this isn't okay, everybody go out and rush and get a mentor thing at all. Yeah, just know that there's so many faculty and staff out here that care so much about us, that are full of wisdom, that really want to spend more time with us, hear our aspirations, and just share a conversation, like Raj said. So another question I have is about inspiring the youth. We're kind of at this crossroad in our age where we have a hand in how the future generation is going to play out. So my question for you is, what should our responsibilities be as student civic leaders in modeling civic engagement and civil discourse to the younger generations?
So let me start with some basic facts. Right? The 14 to 24 age group has, roughly speaking, 40 million young people. Think about 10 to 24-year-olds. You have 68 million young people. In the last election, you had 150 million votes. So if we do a good job of actually getting citizens across this one measure to actually engage, you are absolutely right that what happens with this 15-year generation, right, will have a profound impact on the direction of our country. Profound. And so now the question becomes, how do you ensure that this group of young people are well-informed, are productively engaged, are committed to democracy? First, you have to role model this, right? You have to be able to show to others that it is worth doing. Let me take you on a tangent, but it's really important to understand why this is so important. When we, who are doing our work, we're now with 102 college presidents, but there's 16 schools that are what I'll call in the deep end of the pool. And yes, JMU is in the deep end of the pool, treading along with us. But that deep end is a commitment that each of these institutions have made, that in the next 3 years, we want to get to 100% of the student body, both learning and practicing civil discourse multiple times every single year. That's not happening anywhere in this country, right? And so these 16 schools in partnership with us are really working on that deeply. But there's a tendency to see this kind of work as simply, I'm going to teach you skills. I'm going to teach you how to do civil discourse. I'm going to have Raj come up there and tell you, do X, then do Y, then do Z. That's really important. But it's not in any way sufficient, because you need two other things. And what are those things? One is you need motivation, right? You can learn all the skills that you want, but if you're not motivated to use them, it doesn't matter. And so part of the work that we're doing here at JMU and in these other schools is, how do we make this cool, right? And part of it is literally, how do we make it cool? But also remind you, as I did in my speech, that 86% of employers are going to be looking for these very skills when they make their hiring decisions, right? So hopefully that'll motivate you as well. That's the second piece. And then comes the third piece and how this connects back into my answer. You need to create the social permission for people to do it. And the good news is there's a ton of social research that says you don't need a majority of people doing it in order for others to do it. You actually only need 10%. If 10% of people are doing the right things, other people will start stepping up and doing that as well. So when we talk about what are you doing, the first and most important thing I'd say is actually do the thing. Role model what it means to be well-informed, productively engaged in voting and engaging in your community and trusting and working with people across difference, because that creates a social permission behind you for other people to draft and for other people to start doing it. The second overall thing I would say is that you actually are so lucky to be able to practice this at an institution like this, to build the muscle, that you also have a responsibility. Figure out how it is that you engage in your communities after you leave here, to not only be a role model by yourself, but for your communities that you engage in. And those communities could be your work, it could be the softball or baseball team that you play on, it could be a club that you're part of, it could be the State Department, I'm holding you accountable for the State Department, and so on and so forth. Go figure out how it is that you can get other people to join to be part of this journey. Still hard work, but that's the way in which we're going to make this change, by building the kinds of relationships in the communities that we need.
I think this is a good transition. We got about 10 minutes. Would love to turn to you all. If you got a question for us, we're going to have a couple Democracy Fellows with microphones, questions for Raj or for Ivy. We'd love to open it up to you. Questions? Looks like we got one here in the front. Thanks, Annika.
Yeah. practicing civil discourse can be hard and tiring. I know, like, talking with different people, especially ones that disagree with you. So, Raj, what would be your suggestion for when you're feeling drained and you're feeling like it's just too much? Like, what are your suggestions for, like, that self-care, that mental health, everything that is kind of the unfortunate side effect of sometimes having these difficult conversations?
Yeah, it can be especially hard if you're part of student government. I get it. So thank you for your role, right? I mean, like, it's being on the front lines of this work, and it's really difficult. So I think you're absolutely right that self-care is absolutely critical. There is nothing wrong with saying, you know what, I can't engage in this conversation right now, right? And it's different than saying, I don't want to engage in this conversation. But it is perfectly fine to say, I can't engage in this conversation right now. And in fact, there are times where you can say, look, I actually can't be my best self right now. And I want to be my best self, to be able to empathize, to be able to engage, to be able to mirror and reflect, to listen well. And right now I can't do it, right? So one of the things, just so you know, that I love to do just to go get energy back is I love to kind of just go and jump up and down in a corner. Like, for some reason, like, that makes me more energized. It also makes people get, go, whoa, like, okay, like, I don't know, but like, there's all kinds of ways where you can go and get your energy back. But there's also, giving yourself the time. One of the things that, to me, is really powerful in a conversation is to say, I never thought of it that way. So I need a little bit of time to process that and think about it. Can I come back to you with this, right? And I do that all of the time. It's powerful because it both engages the person you're talking to and saying, look, this is an interesting point, but it also models the level of humility that you hope to see from other people, right? I will tell you, just kind of on a personal level, when you're the boss, the CEO or so on, like, that actually is incredibly powerful and off-putting to folks, right? They'll say something like, wow, I actually never thought of it that. That's actually really thoughtful. Can I get back to you tomorrow after I've spent some time thinking about it? Right? And that actually adds value to the conversation. You don't need to bring every conversation to a close immediately.
Hi, so a little bit about myself. I'm a history major with a minor in secondary education. So I'm trying to be a high school history teacher. But in addition to that, I also have to be familiar with all the different topics of social studies, including political science and civics. So there might be a chance that I would have to teach a civics and economics class. Ivy kind of asked this, but I guess my question would be, what advice would you give to future educators on how to best teach civics to the next and future generations?
Actually, so David joked around and said, easy question. The good news is it's actually a fairly easy answer. There has been, over the last 5 years, some really good program and curriculum being developed. Organizations, kind of everything from the Bill of Rights Institute to iCivics, and this whole movement called the Educating for American Democracy Framework. So all of that actually gives you a powerful step-up framework, curriculum, programming, and so on, so that you don't need to reinvent the wheel as a starting point. So we're actually in a very interesting time that people have started to recognize that you need this curriculum and you need to implement it and so on. Let me not make your life that easy, though. Because the challenge you're actually going to face, I was having this conversation over dinner and a few other times today, is that the last 40 years, I think largely through acts of omission, we have steadily decreased the emphasis on the social studies, especially in secondary education. And I think a large part of it hasn't been on purpose. Let me give you the short version of this. Early 90s, we moved towards the accountability and standards movement in education, right? And we decided that we would measure things to decide whether or not we were successful both on an institutional and school district level as well as with individual children. And we made the fatal mistake of deciding that we would look and measure on things that we could look and measure, which ended up being reading, writing, and math. And so all of our assessment of schools for decades focused on
reading, writing, and math. And if schools are going to be literally closed based around those three measures, guess where all of the money went? Reading, writing, and math for a couple of decades. Then about 15 years ago, we suddenly looked up and said, holy cow, all of the jobs, all of the new jobs are going to be in the STEM field. And so suddenly we invested billions of dollars into the STEM fields. Great, but once again, civics, social studies, history fell further behind. And as it lost not only the luster, but the focus and the investment, we should not be surprised that after 40 years of compounding negative interest in this work, that we're in a huge deficit, right? So we're trying to build back out of a major hole. I thank you for taking this on. We need more people like you. The good news is you have a lot of the tools. The bad news is you're starting at the negative 30-yard line. Thank you.
Looks like I go in here. Third row, fourth row.
Hello. So I know that, like, for me, at least my last senior year, I'm a freshman now, voting was like, everyone just told you to vote and vote. But I feel like it's hard to bring up voting without bringing up politics. And I know the whole, like, Citizens and Scholars is about talking about it without getting angry or being respectful. But how would you bring up voting to, like, peers, like my peers, be like, hey, are you gonna vote, without making it political, really?
So, interesting. So I'm going to answer, and then I want you to push back on me, because I want to make sure I'm actually answering your question. Over the last 250 years, millions of people have died and fought in order to ensure that we have the right to vote. Millions of people want to move to this country from all over the world so that they can actually engage in self-government. We have a gift to decide how we're governed, and a gift to be able to engage in that as deeply or not as deeply. But the gift is also a responsibility. And voting, to me, is the lowest standard by which we engage and acknowledge that gift. Now, I haven't talked about politics at all, but I also appreciate the fact that maybe, you know what? Someone of your age will look at me and go, God, that's a lot of malarkey, right? So am I answering your question or not? Feel free to follow up.
Sort of. I just feel like it's, for me personally, like when I talk to my friends about like not politics, but like voting, I'll be like, hey, do you plan on voting in November? Because for most of the freshman class, it's going to be the first time
That's right.
we're actually voting. And that being a presidential election is a bigger deal. And it usually just comes down to like, well, I don't want to vote for this or this. So I just feel it's like, how do I talk to people? Because I want them to vote, obviously, because it's very important. And it's like the starting point to help people learn more about like civil engagement and stuff. But like, how do I talk to them without getting them on that political rant or being just like, not talking about what they want to happen?
Okay, that's a little harder. So I think, look, it is, in that way, it is impossible to separate out, right, the politics from the responsibility, or as I call it, the gift that you have to vote. It doesn't mean that you need to engage them in that conversation, right? What you can say is, voting is the way in which you demonstrate your point of view. You've just told me your point of view. That's great. I'm glad that you actually have a point of view, right? And please go vote so that, you know, you can actually have one tick that actually determines this. And by the way, I want to point out that in Virginia, it was either 2 or 4 years ago, where there literally was a tie in an election, right? So this is like one place you can actually point to saying every single vote actually does count, right? So I think that you can talk to the value of it, and if people really engage, say, look, I just want you to engage on this. Is that easy? No. I'm not suggesting it's like, oh, that's, that it doesn't work, but that's one part of it. The other part of it that you kind of slipped in that I actually want to challenge a little bit. There's a lot of people that I talk to who have lost so much trust in voting and government that asking them to do this as a first step to being civically engaged is really hard. And I just want to acknowledge that, right? So for some of those people, it's how do I engage in local community in ways that, are helpful for me? How do I go work or volunteer or go to a city council meeting or just go advocate for my point of view in another way so that it starts to build my trust that I actually believe that government will do things. And there are a lot of people who are just like, I can't vote. I just don't trust it. I hope, as Raj Vinnakota, that I can convince them otherwise, but I also want to acknowledge that I haven't been able to convince all of them. And then I go, at least do something and start on that journey.
Let's take one more question. We got time for one last question. I'm going to let our Democracy Fellows pick, because I see more than one hand. Jonathan.
And while Jonathan, they're all the way in the back, Ivy and I were having this conversation this morning, and Ivy plans to go out in the quad tomorrow with a big sign that says, "I also don't like politics, AMA."
Maybe not tomorrow.
But just know that we're having these conversations, and I asked Ivy this question, and I think the people have the microphones now, but I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, absolutely. Just really quick, coming to the polls with passion, you should be like, oh, you seem really passionate about that. Like, maybe take it to the polls. Also, it's partly about opinions and everything, but there's also, on certain elections, there are ballot initiatives like minimum wage and how we feel about things like drug usage and all that stuff, and things that students really do have opinions on, they're also on the ballot. It's not just two people that are running against each other, and it might not be obvious because there's no D or R in parentheses next to certain ballot measures, but there are other things that we can voice our votes with that aren't just one person, which is super important to remember as well.
That's a great point. Last question. We got it? That microphone not working? Speak in your teacher voice. Solving problems in real time. Look at that. Teamwork.
Sorry about that.
Yay. Okay. So to start, I'm a junior, and I'm going to start by saying that this is a question of civil discourse. But I am Ukrainian, and my mother immigrated in the 90s, and I was there for probably 6-7 years. And one of my first experiences at JMU was a difficult conversation with someone who felt very strongly about the war and things like that. So how do you get through conversations where it's just a very difficult conversation, or how do you have the conversation with the person where it's as frustrating or difficult, or maybe you just don't get through it as well? How do you go about, in a civil discourse context, going through those harder conversations?
What's your name? Sorry.
Alexi.
So Alexi, my wife is an East European historian, and so we have lived in many parts of Eastern Europe, and I want to tell you a story, and I don't mean it in the funny way it may come out, but rather as a way that I learned about this in a very specific way. So my wife studied at Georgetown, East European Area Studies, and got to be very close friends with a few Croatians as part of the work that she was doing. This was post-Yugoslavia breakup, post-Dayton peace accords, and so on. And one night, when we were hanging out at our home, we were having a great conversation. At some point, I asked about the massacres and what had happened in Yugoslavia and why it is that we couldn't come to a set of accords that would, be able to partition Yugoslavia effectively. And I learned over the next 20 minutes that I was trying to have an intellectual conversation on a deeply emotional issue that it was impossible to try to intellectualize, right? And after my wife yelled at me from here to tomorrow, that evening after our guests had left, I came to recognize that there are certain issues where you can attempt to have those kinds of conversations, and it is nearly impossible. I learned the hard way, and I learned from a nation close to the Ukraine, that you can be respectful, but sometimes you cannot see eye to eye on some of these things. And I don't want to deny that those situations do exist. So I'm sorry I don't have an answer for you, but I have an experience for you that actually affirms that there are some times that this is really hard.
Absolutely. Thank you for your time.
Raj, we're so grateful for your time with us. We're so grateful for your leadership nationwide. Please join me in thanking Raj for being with us this evening and on campus.